Good morning, everyone, and welcome. Thank you so much for coming at this very blustery day, although gorgeous out. My name is Lisa Bates. I'm on the faculty here at the Toulon School of Urban Studies and Planning, and I'm the director of our research center, the Center for Urban Studies, standing in for our school director, Dr. Kaniyazawa today. She's out of town. So I'm here to welcome you and introduce this morning's speakers. Our citywide speaker series is a continental breakfast here at the Native American Center where our faculty present recent and relevant research that we hope will spur conversation and drive change in our community. I think this morning's topic is particularly timely. Not only given national events, but given our own events here in Portland. We know of our continuing, ongoing challenges at the Portland Police Bureau and questions about oversight, federal oversight, how will oversight happen so that our community and our police could work together and community can feel safe. Drs. Gibson and Dr. Serbulo are going to go backwards and give us our historical roots of police and community issues, relations here in Portland, particularly for African American community. This paper, you can find it actually for free online at the Oregon Historical Quarterly. It has been awarded, and congratulations, the Joelle Palmer Award for Best Paper in the Oregon Historical Quarterly for 2014. And so it's available to everyone as a PDF. And I would encourage everyone to find those details later. So we'll be hearing from Dr. Gibson and Dr. Serbulo, both faculty here at Portland State and Toulon School faculty. You want to take it away? Great, welcome, thanks everyone.
Good morning. How's everybody this morning? Thank you so much for coming on this early time period. It's great to have a nice turnout this morning. So I'm very pleased to be here with my partner in crime, Dr. Serbulo. We've been working together quite a while on a number of projects concerning Portland's African American community and social justice issues pertaining to that. I am going to start out with some background and on what's going on, and then Leanna will take over. Dr. Serbulo will take over for me. Can everybody hear me okay? All right, good. You're all comfy? Got your coffee? Wide awake? Okay, good. All right. Perceptions of police as occupiers. This is not a new phenomenon, and that's what's been going on, right, with the Ferguson killing of Michael Brown that has brought national attention to this issue this year. When you dress officers like an occupying army, they act like an occupying army. And we all know what happens in countries that we've occupied. Atrocities are committed. And that was just said this year by former Philadelphia Police Chief Ray Lewis. So in our paper published last year, we talk about this notion of communities feeling occupied, even without the army garb. This has been going on for many, many years. Those of you, and it's rooted in this idea that all white policemen who aren't knowledgeable about the community and of or from the community are policing a group of people who are colonized, and I'll get into that theory. It's rooted in anti-black sentiment and ghettoization within the urban north. And not that there's not policing issues in southern cities, but the idea that you are, policing a foreign area is part of ghettoization. And when I say ghettoization, you have to understand that ghettoization is a process of residential segregation, placing people in control, like within urban reservations, containing them, and then policing in that. I haven't been teaching this year, so I'm a little rusty. I'll have to relax a little bit here. Okay, so in the Albina district, this map shows you in Northeast Portland, as early as the 1930s, the Portland Realty Board had designated that area as the place to contain African Americans. This is when the population was less than 2,000 people. World War II comes, you get a huge migration of about 20,000 black workers to come here, and they were also ghettoized within that area, okay? So that by 1960, 80% of black Portlanders, of 15,000 black Portlanders are in this area. And during the 50s, as blacks were moving in the post-war era, whites moved out, right? We've heard of white flight. Very interesting always to me. I got interested in Albina because in coming to Portland 16 years ago, and after studying urban poverty and ghettoization and concentration of poverty in Pittsburgh and Detroit, it was always fascinating me that even in a tiny city like Portland in the remote Northwest, you still have the phenomenon of ghettoization and all that goes with it, high unemployment, bad housing conditions, and that thing. So how and why does that occur has been the subject of study for many years. By 1970, Portland's segregation level was the second highest on the West Coast, behind only Los Angeles. For those of you that are familiar with a measure called the Dissimilarity Index, it was 86 in 1970 at the block group level. That is extremely high concentration. This segregation, this anti-black sentiment is a leftover, a holdover. We got to go back to slavery days, okay? White supremacy, you are oppressed, will never be welcome into our society. Therefore, you must be separate because we don't want you going to our churches, our schools, working with us, intermarrying. Okay, people used to go up to Washington to get intermarried, okay? Intermarried. But you have a setup where our study starts in '64 of some neighborhoods being more than 2/3 black, some were 80% black. Some blocks were probably 100% black, yet the entire police force was white. Okay. Here's a quote from James Baldwin. Can everybody see that in the back? Is it large enough? Okay, well then I will read it. Policing the ghetto, a bitter country. The only way to this is from 1960. The only way to police a ghetto is to be oppressive. Their presence is an insult, and it would be, even if they spent their entire day feeding gumdrops to the children. They represent the force of the white world and that world's criminal profit and ease to keep the black man corralled up here in its place. The badge, the gun, and the holster, and the swinging club may make vivid what will happen should his rebellion become overt. He moves through Harlem, therefore, like an occupying soldier in a bitterly hostile country, which is precisely what and where he is, and is the reason he walks in 2s and 3s. And back in the 60s, policemen would only go by 2s into Albina, whereas they would go solo into other neighborhoods. So in the 60s, there became a framework. People started identifying with anti-colonial struggles internationally and interpreting their position in the social structure as ghettoized and disempowered, okay? Black urbanites, they interpret their position as that of a colonized community, especially in the face of repression against the freedom struggle. During 60s rebellions in cities, they increasingly identified with international struggles. So here we have a quote from a youth worker in 1967. There were riots in Portland, Irving Park. A quote, "Albina is categorized as a colony, something separate and foreign from the rest of the city. The mayor wouldn't come to that neighborhood." So the theory, sociologist Robert Staples is one of the persons who used this theory to evaluate and analyze criminal justice. Police in black neighborhoods constitute an army of occupation within the domestic or internal colony. And if you get our paper and read it, I urge you to do so. It goes into how this theory never really was accepted within regular academic circles because of its association with what? Black power and militancy. You weren't supposed to go there. It's okay to be civil rights and to want to integrate and accommodate into existing institutions. But this theory suggests that the only way to make change is to change institutions and for communities to have control over their own institutions, schools, police, so forth. Space, power, and social control, police were enforcers of this colonial relationship. So often the only time you're seeing whites in your community is in the symbol of police, right? In these days of high levels of segregation. Police are agents to enforce the status quo and protect the property of the colonizers who live outside of the community. And key to this is that within black communities and other repressed communities, police are not seen as your friendly neighborhood policemen, but because of the experience of harassment and intimidation, being treated with derogatory names and epithets is a common thing, okay? You are looking for public safety, you're looking for the policeman to give you what is happening in other communities, right, in the predominant community, but you're not necessarily getting public safety. Reverend Boyd was part of a group, co-founder of the Albina Ministerial Alliance in the 1960s, says, "We knew our part of the city had been designated to allow vice activities." And that's what Baldwin was talking about when he said criminal profit. Because people have to know that along with segregation and disinvestment, okay, in the lack of conventional lending for business, for housing, okay, there's profit to be made from ghettoization, from a dual housing market, okay? So wealth is being extracted from the community. Vice is allowed, gambling, prostitution, drugs, which has a long history in Portland, as people should know, is contained in that community. In this, Reverend Boyd had met with one of the deputy chiefs of police who said, and even Mayor Shrunk in the 60s said, because vice and crime and prostitution and drugs are confined to your community, we do not need to have any additional police presence. It was not a problem. So the perception in the community is that the police we need public safety, but we're not necessarily getting it. A letter to the mayor from one of the Albina residents. For years, black people in the Albina area have been bullied and victimized by our so-called lawmen. So Albina's designation as the area where crime and vice flourish prevents citizens from being accepted by the whole community. And only revitalization and gentrification, to be sure, have only occurred when finally when the area was transformed for a place for outsiders to invest and reap profits as slumlords, okay, and with high interest loans. People were advised within the real estate community, don't buy to live there, buy only to invest. And it was only when they started doing public safety measures to make it safe for the new people that the area started to revitalize. So this issue of crime, public safety, is all part of the same process that is happening across the country. So residential segregation of the unwanted, unwelcome people. Right now I've just finished studying the 40s really in earnest. And this was going on so strongly in the 40s that crime, people, there was police hysteria. The police chief Jenkins, okay, who in the 20s policed Coontown, okay, in Northwest Portland, and who bragged about getting 150 KKK members to join the police force. He was still there in the 40s. And when the population boomed because of the war migration, there was police hysteria, and Dr. Unthank and some of the other leaders in the black community were saying, no, 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 wait a minute. We don't commit crimes anymore, and there was no evidence for this, okay? But I'm just saying criminalization goes hand in hand with keeping the community down. Tombstone territory, that's what it was called by the assistant deputy chief. Unwanted space becomes a zone for the unwanted but profitable activities. The Albina neighborhood and everyone in it becomes criminalized, and there's policing for social control rather than safety. So there's a tension between what the community wants, public safety, but a problem because what happens is racial profiling. In the early 60s, there was a demand by people in the community to have some more policing because of all the vice activities, and people couldn't come and go necessarily freely without being harassed and so forth. So there's a police sweep, but the effect of the sweep is just innocent people would be caught up in it. And so the Northwest Defender of Black Paper said, good persons should not feel offended or persecuted, but cooperate with officers. Okay, I'm turning it over to my colleague.
Thank you. So our paper begins in 1964, and it begins with an incident that happened, the death of Cleotis Rhodes at the hands of Portland police. Cleotis Rhodes was shot in the back. The police said he was trying to escape. But what made the incident something that was interesting and that was that had really galvanized the community was the fact that he had been stopped and pulled over for reckless driving. He was driving erratically, and he was pulled over by the police. And Cleotis Rhodes fled the scene. The police officer followed him back to his home. There was a struggle on their porch. At one point, the police officer's gun fell out of his holster, and Cleotis Rhodes' wife picked it up and handed it back to the officer. The officer then arrested Mr. Rhodes, brought him in a squad car, and took him down to the station. And somehow, on the way to the station, it was said that Mr. Rhodes had tried to escape from the back of the police car, and he ended up being shot in the back. That case went to the grand jury, and the grand jury cleared Officer Freeman of any wrongdoing. However, they found his actions indefensible, and they also wondered why he had not driven Mr. Rhodes to a hospital that was just a few blocks away, but instead he brought him across town as he lay bleeding and dying in the back of the police car. Now this not only galvanized the community, but it also had a big impact on Chief McNamara, who was the incoming police chief at that time, and he was upset by this incident too, and he instituted a policy change which said you could only use deadly force in cases of self-defense or when dealing with an escaping felon, not somebody who was escaping from a misdemeanor. So at this time, the civil rights movement had been going on since there had been segregation and oppression here in Portland and across the nation. But at this time, police brutality really becomes a key issue in the civil rights movement here in Portland. And during that time, the civil rights movement kind of shifted, and as more young people got involved, and as people really began to see their communities as a colony, the demand shifted from integration to actually having self-determination or community control over the institutions within the neighborhood, and it became more of a Black Power movement. So during this time, Melvin Spencer, who was the brother-in-law of Cleotis Rhodes, began to organize around issues of police brutality. He was working for an anti-poverty group at that time called CCAP, and they began to hold forums with different members of the interfaith community on issues of police brutality. And that drew the attention of the Portland police. Prior to this time, the civil rights movement really hadn't attracted the attention of the Portland police very much, but when they started talking about issues of police brutality and harassment, the police began to pay excruciating attention to the movement. In the 1960s, we often don't think of our police department, of their job as kind of monitoring people who are engaging in political dissent. We think of that maybe in East Germany or Egypt or different places. But in the 1960s, really it was a primary duty of the police department to keep track of subversives. that might not have been the reason why people would sign up to become a police officer. They wanted to protect people and have public safety, but in a survey of police officers that was conducted in the mid-1960s, keeping track of subversives was the eighth most important aspect of policing. It came in ahead of helping little old ladies and traffic duties. And that really has its roots here in Portland back in the 1920s, when the police bureau really became active in monitoring dissent here in the city with the Red Squads. And also nationally, the FBI, which we often think of like the arrest of John Dillinger or maybe some of the work that they did against the mafia, but during J. Edgar Hoover's reign, the primary duty of the FBI was to monitor, surveil, disrupt, and destroy political dissidents here in this country. So civil rights activists prior to this time really didn't have the intelligence unit, which was charged with keeping track of subversives in the Portland Police Bureau, really didn't pay much attention to the civil rights movement prior to this time. There's a few examples, if you look back in some of the archival information of in the 1950s when the civil rights movement had an organization that co-sponsored them when they were trying to get laws to integrate public accommodations. There was a group that was perceived to be communist, and at that point, the police intelligence unit became interested in the civil rights movement. But that's really the only example of it. Prior to that, they weren't interested in what civil rights activists were doing until they started criticizing the police and until there was more militancy and the movement really shifted to become a Black Power movement. So keeping track and monitoring subversives didn't just mean collecting information or monitoring what was going on with groups that were opposed to the political structure. It was more than that. It was actively disrupting, harassing, and sabotaging, basically trying to destroy these particular groups. And here's a quote by a Portland police lieutenant who worked for the intelligence unit. He described his job as like making bread. You take a little flour, water, yeast, and massage it and come up with a product. The COINTELPRO program was the counterintelligence program, and this wasn't just happening on a local scale, this was also happening on a national scale. And the COINTELPRO program was the counterintelligence program. It was a top secret program within the FBI, and the purpose of that program really was to destroy and disrupt any sort of political dissident, any sort of political movements that were going on in this country. And there's countless examples of what COINTELPRO did. They did things such as try to drive wedges between the East Coast and the West Coast Black Panther Party movements by writing fake letters from the leaders of one chapter to another chapter to try to get them to foster infighting. There's examples of the FBI going to Wounded Knee, to the Pine Ridge Reservation, and framing people for killings that they didn't commit. And there's actually examples of people dying from this program, such as Fred Hampton in Chicago. And an example of what that was like and how that was instituted here in Portland, there was a chapter of the Black Panther Party in Portland, and I think in 1970 they began their breakfast program. So they began serving free breakfast to children at Highland Church, which is near where King School is. And in order to, the Black Panther Party didn't have a big bank account, it didn't have a lot of donors that were giving to it, so they would have to go door to door to try to solicit donations for the breakfast program, to try to get things like eggs and milk and bread and sausage to be able to feed the children. So they would go around to different Albina businesses and try to solicit donations, either in the form of food or in the form of money. When the people that owned a battery shop in Albina had the Black Panthers come in to solicit a donation from them, they called the police. And they complained because when the Black Panthers came in, they said they leaned on our counters and they made people in our business feel uncomfortable. So, you know, a police force that is geared towards public safety might take a complaint like that and dismiss it, saying basically, you know, there's nothing here, you're feeling uncomfortable by people coming in, but it doesn't seem like a crime is going on. However, given the purpose of trying to disrupt and destroy some of these political movements, the police took this very seriously. And they decided to conduct a survey of every single business in the Albina area to see if they could come up with evidence of the Black Panther Party trying to basically shake down businesses and extort money out of them to fund their breakfast program. So people who were working the beat in Albina, the different officers that were working in the beat, were told to go out and go to every single business, go door to door, and find out if the Black Panther Party had indeed come in there and if there was any evidence of them extorting money from the different businesses. So the beat cops went out and did a survey of the area, and they found absolutely no evidence of a Black Panther Party extortion ring. But that's just to give you an idea of how policing really wasn't about public safety, but it was about social control. Throughout this time, from the model cities planning process to throughout the whole spectrum of the civil rights movement that was occurring, from people participating in different public processes to people calling for an independent police force in Albina, there were three main demands that the community was making. They wanted to have an end to police harassment and brutality. They wanted civilian oversight of the police force, and they wanted increased Black representation in law enforcement. And there's kind of a fourth demand that's implied in this too. They also wanted their communities to be safe, just like everybody wants their community to be safe. So they wanted to get rid of the crime and drugs and prostitutions that had plagued their community. They didn't want their community to be tombstone territory. Despite all the different efforts that were going on, rallies, protests, letter writing campaigns, those three demands were not realized during that time. However, when Robert Probasco and 13 other Albina residents filed a class action lawsuit in U.S. District Court against the mayor, the city council, the chief of police, and 38 named officers, that resulted in some changes. That suit, there was not a guilty plea found, but there was basically a consent decree that was written up, and a consent decree implies that there was no wrongdoing on the part of the city. But the city agreed to make these changes despite the fact that they wouldn't admit that they had been doing any wrongdoing. So the changes that they agreed to make in 1971 as a result of that class action lawsuit were to stop the use of racial epithets, to ban the use of sap gloves and leaded batons, to say that all officers had to have a search warrant before they would enter Albina homes, to have their officers take racial sensitivity training, to establish a way for citizens to file complaints against the police, and to institute an affirmative action plan so that they could diversify the police force. In the 1970s, the results of the Probasco decree started becoming instituted. There was also a change in city government and a more progressive regime took over. And the first change that happened was the establishment of the Internal Affairs Bureau within the Portland Police Department. The Internal Affairs was a way for citizens to file complaints against the police force. Prior to the establishment of Internal Affairs, the Internal Affairs Department, there was no way for people to complain or to file some sort of complaint against the police. However, Internal Affairs was not civilian oversight. This was a department within the Portland Police Bureau, and it was basically the police policing themselves. And as a result, there were less than 10% of those complaints that were found to be sustained or found to be valid. Affirmative action also took place. There was an affirmative action officer that was hired in the early 1970s. However, he quit after just 1 year in office because he was never invited or allowed to participate in any of the hiring or training meetings that were happening within the Portland Police Bureau. So after that, the Police Bureau actually had a pretty ambitious plan to diversify the police force and set goals to try to hire a more diverse officer corps. However, by 1980, the Portland Police Bureau was still 97% white, and there were only 12 Black officers. Chief Baker was also hired in the early 1970s. He was the first outsider to lead the Bureau. He came from Berkeley, California. And in 1974, this might sound familiar to a lot of people because we just recently completed a Department of Justice investigation here in Portland. That wasn't the first time that the Department of Justice came to Portland. The Department of Justice came at the behest of the Black community in 1974, and they came in to investigate whether or not there was a pattern of civil rights violations after 4 young Black men had been killed by the police in a 6-month period. And what really sparked outrage within the community was that 4th killing. It was a young man named Ricky Charles Johnson. He was just 17 years old, so that's kind of echoes of the Mike Brown shooting that happened in Ferguson. He was shot in the back of the head, and he was shot by Officer Kenneth Sanford, who had been going undercover because Ricky Charles Johnson was at a house where a robbery had taken place. A taxi driver had gone to deliver Chinese food to that particular house, and he was robbed of $10. So he called the police and reported it. When somebody from that house called to order food again from the taxi company, Kenneth Sanford went undercover as a taxi driver. He had his gun and a box of food, and when he went to the door and there was some sort of suspicious activity going on, the young man that answered the door fled the house, and he saw somebody standing in the shadows and said the young man, Ricky Charles Johnson, had pulled a gun on him, and he ended up being shot in the back of the head. The Department of Justice investigated. They found that there was no pattern or practice of civil rights violations going on in Portland. That's a very high standard that the Department of Justice has to find in order to sustain a judgment of having a pattern or practice of civil rights violations. But they were careful to qualify that by saying that they didn't think that any of these shootings were necessarily justified. They thought that there were problems with each of these incidents, but that there wasn't an overall pattern or practice of civil rights violations. And then during this time, too, COINTELPRO, that counterintelligence program of the FBI, was exposed nationally. So that kind of shifted policing and really made people question some of these institutions like police and government. The reforms that happened might not have had a big effect on how people within communities were really experiencing policing in Portland, because each of those reforms in and of themselves were not necessarily all that effective. But one of the greatest impacts of each of those reforms was the backlash that they produced. The Portland Police Association is the police officers union here in Portland. We were one of the first cities to actually have a union for our police force. And prior to this time, that union had really achieved a lot of things in terms of improving the working conditions and the working life for police officers who work for the Portland Police Bureau. But during the 1970s, Stan Peters took over as president, and he really kind of shifted that union's focus from just being an advocate for police officers' rights in the workplace to really kind of becoming a political force within the city that had significant influence over the different policies that would affect how policing was done in Portland. The Portland Police Association, under Stan Peters' regime, took a hardline stance against any reforms. They became really active in different political campaigns, giving money and throwing their weight and support behind different candidates for city council office. They were part of an overall national movement which was called the Blue Power Movement, and it was kind of a backlash of police against the criticisms of the Black Power movement. And part of what the Portland Police Association did was they would file civil lawsuits against people who had resisted arrest and an officer got injured. That was one of the things that they were doing that other police unions found really exciting and saw that as a part of the forefront of the Blue Power movement. They also filed suit on policy issues, so they filed suit to stop affirmative action policies that were happening within the Portland Police Bureau at that time. So the backlash, the reforms that were ineffective, and then the backlash that was sparked by the Portland Police Association created another wave of community movements for police reforms. So in the late 1970s and early 1980s, the Black United Front became an active organization here in Portland, and their two primary demands were to change the one-way segregation policies within Portland public schools, and also to take on some of the disproportionate arrest and imprisonment rates of blacks here in Portland. At that time, blacks in Multnomah County were arrested at 5 times the rates of whites, which even exceeded the 3 times national rate. Oregon and Washington at that time had the most disproportionate rates of imprisonment of black men in the nation. So the Pacific Northwest was really kind of stood out in terms of racial profiling within the criminal justice system. And the way in which the Black United Front decided to try to change things was to appeal to the United Nations Human Rights Commission. And in 1981, they filed a complaint with the United Nations Human Rights Commission and asked them to come and investigate in Portland. The Human Rights Commission receives hundreds of thousands of complaints every year, and they decided not to investigate the one that was filed by the Black United Front. During that time, too, Charles Jordan was elected as the first black city commissioner, and when he was put on the city council, one of the bureaus that he was in charge of, he became the commissioner of police. He went out of his way in the beginning of his term to really kind of appeal to stampeders and to listen to the Portland Police Association and to try to kind of bend over backwards and find out what it was that police officers wanted. He knew that as a black commissioner, he was going to face some resistance from the Portland Police Association. He really went out of his way to try to find common ground with them. However, when he began to criticize the civil service exam and say that it wasn't fair to non-white potential police hirees, and he wanted to change that examination, that's when the Portland Police Association really began to see Charles Jordan as an enemy. And so during that time, he really started pushing for reforms. And he created a citizens task force to study the internal affairs department and see if that was an effective or not an effective way for citizens to file complaints. In 1981, just a few months after the Black United Front filed a complaint with the United Nations Human Rights Commission, a popular black-owned restaurant called the Burger Barn in the middle of the night found dead possums dropped on their doorstep. And witnesses to that event said that there had been 4 police cars in their parking lot and 7 officers, and 2 officers were identified as having dropped those dead possums on the front doorstep of the Burger Barn. The community was outraged by this racist attack, and they held rallies and protests and asked the city council to do something about that. They wanted the 2 officers who were involved, Officers Ward and Galloway, to be fired. Charles Jordan said, hey, let's let the internal affairs department do their job and see what happens, but community pressure became too much, and he eventually fired Ward and Galloway. Well, that sparked a backlash, as we've seen this kind of constant cycle of resistance, reform, and then backlash to reform. That happened in this case too. And the Portland Police Association took a vote of no confidence against Charles Jordan, against the mayor, against Chief Baker, and then they organized and held a rally called a Cops Have Rights 2 rally, where 1,000 police marched in downtown Portland. As a result of that Cops Have Rights 2 rally, Mayor Avanci took control of the police department out from Charles Jordan's purview and put it under his own purview. Charles Jordan basically commented saying that what is happening here is Stan Peters is basically running the city, and that was the president of the Portland Police Association. When Avanci took control of the police bureau, he changed things, and a lot of those reforms that had happened kind of moved backwards. He hired a new chief, Ron Still, who had been involved in some of the disruption of the Black Panther Party breakfast program, and he had also been involved in some of the scandals that had plagued the police department in the late 1970s. And one of the first actions that happened was the Portland Police Association appealed the firing of Ward and Galloway, who were involved in the possum incident, and an arbitrator ruled that they had to be reinstated, so they got their jobs back. During that time, too, while Ward and Galloway were fired, they were still earning a living. The Portland Police Association hired them and paid them their equivalent salaries and gave them jobs on their newspaper. However, Charles Jordan's reforms were still going on because that task force continued to meet, and they were charged with coming up with a way to provide some oversight to the internal affairs process. And they came up with a proposal to have a committee called the Police Internal Investigations Auditing Committee, or PIAC, and that committee would provide some sort of oversight and review of the cases that the Internal Affairs Commission reviewed. The City Council approved the establishment of PIAC, and then the Portland Police Association sponsored a ballot measure to actually put this up for vote among the city and to have a referendum as to whether or not PIAC would be established. They put it to a citywide vote, and it barely passed. This was the first iteration of civilian review, but PIAC had such a narrow scope that it was basically ineffective. All they could do, they couldn't investigate anything. They couldn't call witnesses. All they could do was review the cases that the Internal Affairs Division had reviewed, and then they could make a recommendation or a suggestion to Internal Affairs that, okay, we'll send this back to you. Maybe you should reinvestigate it, but it had no teeth to it at all. So by 1987, after being in existence for 5 years, only 2 of their 28 recommendations had been followed. And this is a continuing theme in the struggle to get civilian oversight of the Portland Police Department, that every single committee that exists really doesn't have the power to do the job, an effective job of civilian oversight. In 1985, we close this chapter of Portland history with, just as it began with the death of Cleotis Rhodes, it closes in 1985 with the death of Tony Stevenson. He was an off-duty security guard and a former Marine who had gone to a convenience store one night to get food for his kids. And while he was there was an altercation. Somebody came in and got in an argument with the clerk at the store, and Tony Stevenson helped the clerk subdue this man and hold him until the police could arrive. When the police arrived, it was Tony Stevenson that they targeted, and Officer Gary Barber put him in a chokehold and basically choked him to death. After that incident happened, again, this sparked community outrage and protest, and Chief Penny Harrington banned the use of a chokehold by officers. As a result of that, that also provoked some backlash. And officers created T-shirts that said, "Smoke 'em, don't choke 'em," and they printed those up, and they began selling them on the day of Tony Stevenson's funeral. Both of those incidents caused more protest and outrage, so not only the death of Tony Stevenson, but also the printing of those T-shirts and the selling of those T-shirts. And officers Monty and Wickersham, who had printed up those T-shirts, were initially fired. And then again, the Portland Police Association appealed their firing to a state arbitrator, and they were reinstated. They lost 6 months' pay. Tony Stevenson's death, for the first time since 1974, and the death of Ricky Charles Jordan, there was a public inquest held, which is basically like a public trial. And the purpose of the inquest in the 1974 case was to determine whether or not that case should go to a grand jury. In this case, there was a public inquest held, but it would have the results of the inquest would not be any action brought against a police officer. Basically, the results of the inquest could not be used in any further court proceedings, but there was basically a trial held where the death of Tony Stevenson was looked at and a jury made a decision, and they proclaimed that the death was homicide. But that would have no bearing upon the grand jury process where Officer Barber was found to have not committed a crime. Later, Tony Stevenson's family would sue the city and would have one of the largest settlements up until that time. I think there's been larger ones since, of I think $600,000 that the city would have to pay out for wrongful death. So throughout our entire study period, let's go back to those 3 demands that the community was asking for. From the death of Cleotis Rhodes up until the death of Tony Stevenson, there was very little progress made in terms of trying to end police brutality and harassment. No officers were held accountable for deaths at all during that time. There was slightly more progress made on the civilian oversight front. In 1964, there was no way for a civilian to file a complaint against the police, and at least with the establishment of internal affairs, there was a way that you could file a complaint, even if that complaint wouldn't necessarily go anywhere. So there wasn't an effective civilian oversight panel that was established, but at least there was a mechanism for civilians to be able to file a complaint. And then in terms of affirmative action, in this study period, we aren't seeing much of a diversification of the police force, but since that time, there has been more affirmative action within the Portland Police Bureau. So what lessons have we learned from looking at this history and looking at where we are today? What we've learned by looking at the interaction between movements for reforms, sparking backlash, sparking more movements for reform, sparking backlash, we saw that every attempt at reform was met with resistance by the police and often by the city, too. The intelligence unit during the 1960s and then later in the 1970s and 80s, the police union were used to try to bully activists that were trying to get reforms from the police. And city officials would often back down whenever there was any sort of backlash from officials within the Portland Police or from the Portland Police Union. And police reform was never a high priority for elected officials. It wasn't something that they would necessarily run for their council positions on. It was something that they had to take up because the community forced them to take these issues up. We also discovered that the most progress was made when there was outside pressure or oversight. So all those reforms that happened in the 1970s were really a result of the Probasco decree by having a court-ordered consent agreement take place. And even the U.S. Department of Justice coming to town, even though they didn't find a pattern and practice of civil rights violations, and even though the United Nations never investigated that complaint, just having some sort of outside force force the city to take these issues seriously was very effective. And so when we look at police-community relations today, despite the fact that gentrification has occurred, despite the fact that African Americans are now more dispersed around the city, this notion of an internal colony is still relevant today. Many people still feel as though they're under occupation, and there remains this tension within the community between wanting public safety, yet fearing the police and fearing racial profiling. Politicians are the ones that we discovered in our study were the ones that actually have the power to make reforms. So they're the ones that also have the responsibility to make sure that these reforms take place. And it's when outside oversight happens that these politicians are actually held accountable, and that ensures that reform will happen. However, it takes community pressure to get there. So those reforms didn't kind of come out of nowhere. It came from people organizing and people mobilizing to try to make some sort of change. Thank you. And this paper is available for free on the Oregon Historical Quarterly's website, and there's a lot of other wonderful and interesting articles within that publication as well. So I encourage you to go to their website and to download the paper and read about the full story.
Thanks so much. We have some time to have questions and answers. I'll help Dr. Gibson and Dr. Serbulo moderate. Thank you so much for that presentation. So critical to understand where we've come from and maybe where we haven't gone very far, but we've been somewhere and now we're somewhere, and it's important to learn that. Questions for our authors? Do you want to stand up here? Michael sent me to do that.
Oh, that's bullshit. Hi. Oh, I do want to. So thank you all for listening. Hope you could understand that. And again, I urge you to read the paper. There's a lot more even in the paper that we couldn't get out here today. Unfortunately, this tragic story about relationships between our local government and the community, the communities, the people, is still wrought with tension. And what's interesting is that we bookend the paper with a couple of killings. We don't highlight all the other killings that occurred. But in the 1970s, 60% of the people that were killed by the police were black men, despite the fact that black men constituted, well, not black men, but the black population only constituted 7% of the city. So that's why you have to understand the spatial social control, okay? So the police are policing areas where vice, crime, all this stuff is allowed and in fact encouraged. Because believe me, city has long made profits out of vice, gambling, drugs, prostitution. If you read anything about Portland's history, we were part of a big investigation in the 60s with Robert Kennedy on the corruption among the police and city. We've had mayors retire because of their scandalous, the vaults they have in the mayor's office where they're collecting paybacks. And a great person to read about this history, even earlier history, to really understand this is, what's his name? E. Kimbark McCall's books. I think it's The Shaping of the City. He has 3 on Portland. But in 1911, the Vice Commission, what's interesting is the relationship between vice, between these very profitable activities and the elites. So that many of the people that owned the homes in the original vice area in Northwest Portland, or the buildings, were the greatest names. Okay, the prostitution houses, gambling, were the big people up in the hills here, okay? So there's a relationship. Anyway, I don't want to go on and on because I'm not allowing you to answer questions, and Lisa is giving me the eye. So any questions? Yes, Eliza. Also, Eliza is the editor, stand up, of OHQ that hounded my Dr. Serbulo and I to revise and revise and revise this paper. So thank you. Thank you for coming.
Here for peer review. My question has to do with those spatial relationships, and it may not be fair to ask about contemporary life today, so if that's not a question you can answer, that's fine. But as the gentrification of Northeast Portland has happened, as the displacement of populations happened, I live out on 74th in Southeast, and I see even my neighborhood in Foster, Powell changing, and East Portland. So the colonization framework that you used in that paper was so effective, particularly in thinking about the longer term history of this place and the colonization that's been happening here for a couple hundred years. How are these spatial relationships working now? Is this something that you know about? Where are people still being grouped, and if so, where, and how is that working?
No, that's a very good question, because I think that the application of the colonial model doesn't still work, right? Because of the spatial dispersion that has been taking place. I think it still works. People like Joanne Bowman, who are involved in living in East Portland, you know, people are still, there's still clusters of people living, like say in East Portland, and people are still targeted and identified, okay? Don't wear a hoodie, right? You're a black male, you wear a hoodie, you're being profiled. There's still clusters of people still gather, but yes, how does the relationship play out today? The thing is that there's also the economic oppression that has gone on for so very long. 50% unemployment right after the war. I mean, black male unemployment has been double or triple white unemployment rates for many, many years. This, you know, accumulation, okay? So that's a good question about the application of the model. Even we cite the new Jim Crow, Michelle Alexander's book, where she talks about people still viewing occupation. There's still many segregated places. There's still many segregated schools. Schools within Northeast Portland were now still about 20% black in 2010. Schools are still very much segregated though, okay? So you have different levels of segregation.
And just as I think when we look internationally at colonization, we see sometimes a diaspora of people, and that people are still experiencing economic oppression, political oppression, and different forms of control, even if they're no longer living in an area that had been formerly colonized. So if you look, for example, at people from the Caribbean that have moved to Europe, there's still sort of this, within this diaspora, this idea of being colonized, even if you're living in the colonizer's country. So I think it's still applicable today. I'm not quite sure how there hasn't been much scholarship on how that would apply to today, but it's something that we could all think about.
Yes.
I thought it was a terrific presentation. I look forward to reading that paper, but I want to move from the theory to the case. How typical was Portland? The fact that it had, say, 6 or 7% black population, and now, say, less than 5%, was the population, because it was so small, less able to leverage the political system than a place like Oakland or Nashville? Is the Portland case one in which the police were less accountable because they didn't have to pay a political price?
Well, my opinion, I haven't studied all cities at all times. My opinion is that the same kind of relationships, the same kind of power structure happened all along, especially the West Coast, okay? And in urbanized areas across the country, in terms of people being disempowered, spatially isolated, and not having so much authority or political power. So I'll let Leanna, if you want to answer.
I think that like Karen said, we haven't done a comparative study, so it's hard to say precisely whether or not that was the case, but I think that certainly played into politicians never having police reform as part of their platform here in Portland. And even today, the city recently filed suit to not have to have a judge oversee their agreement that they're implementing with the Department of Justice. And so I don't imagine that that would necessarily happen in a more diverse city. I think that the fact that the city feels that they could ignore the demands of the Black community definitely plays into the decisions that were made. But that's something that I just wanted to emphasize from our paper as well. I know it's not answering your question, Bob, but the fact that the findings that we found, that when an outside agency kind of forces the city, that's when change actually gets made. So what we're seeing happen today is the exact opposite of what we found in the paper. So I would encourage everybody here to contact your city council people and to encourage them to not file that suit and to pull that suit so that we can have a judge hold us accountable and make sure that those reforms that are supposed to be instituted by the Department of Justice agreement that's happening right now are instituted.
And let me just add something, actually, to put in especially students' minds. I hope many of you will plow into this kind of subject area if you're interested. But keep in mind, when you talk about racial oppression, think about South Africa. 90% Black population. It's not always the size of the population, okay? It's the power relations. John?
Hi. Could you talk a little bit about your sources? Just
No. Next. Go ahead.
I have my social science methods class with me.
Oh, okay.
And I'm just curious about if I could hear about your sources. Are they accessible? Is there...
Well, Mary is here. She's one of the archivists from the city Stanley Park Archive Center, which is on the 5th floor of the new building right across from the Urban Center. So the city archives was one of our primary sources for this, and there's just an amazing amount of information there. And Mary's a critical person in the archives, and she knows everything about what's in the archives, and she's very, very helpful. So Stanley Park Archives and Research Center was instrumental in helping us do this research.
And it's free and open. We have open hours that are listed online. Anybody can come in. So as long as it's during hours, and you get to work together. It's not all me. It's really the people that come in and do the research. I just help find stuff for them.
Yeah, if Dr. Serbulo would have time, she did a fantastic job of tracking down so much of the detailed data, and especially with the police unions. Their newspaper was the rap sheet was one of the sources that she used to get that perspective. Yeah, very interesting. Yes.
Well, your use of bringing in drugs advice into the context of both the area and the police reminds many of us who were here at the time of the Gypsy Joker incident, where the police themselves, this wasn't a Black motorcycle gang, but they were involved in drugs advice, and the police had a fatal raid on their headquarters on North Lombard because they were competing with the police vice squad's own drug advice operations. And is there some, I don't know how much there is in art city archives in relationship to the possibility of a still corrupt police force in the 70s and 80s, if not now. And how do we, how can we, as a broader community outside of even the racial context, have an accountable police?
Yeah, and this is everybody's issue. It's not just one particular racial or ethnic group, but police accountability is everybody's issue. That incident, we didn't write much about it in the paper, but Ron Still, who became the chief of police, was heavily involved in the unit that was investigated for the Gypsy Joker scandal. And actually in that scandal, there was a police officer that was killed by that motorcycle gang, and they had to drop the charges, and that man had to go free because of the fact that there was so much corruption going on. So I can't speak at all to any corruption that may or may not be going on today, but just that police accountability is everybody's issue, and I think it makes us a better city when we have civilian oversight and we have transparency.
Yes, Naomi?
You point to something that's pretty, I think, troubling for a lot of people who want to be supportive both of organized labor and of communities that are experiencing police oppression, which is that the police union is actually actually behind a lot of the resistance to transparency, to fairness, to justice in the Black community. And I was wondering where other unions and other labor organizations fell out on this, and how that affected the racial dynamic in the city.
Well, other unions you ask about? Yeah, it's interesting. After refreshing myself with this article again last night, there was a time at which the police union organized a protest in response to one of these, attempts to be held accountable. And as a union, they did, with Stan Peters, they marched on the waterfront. And yes, the waterfront workers organized with them. Yeah. So police unions, actually, that's another subject of investigation that should happen, because this is an issue. On the one hand, you want employee protection, and of course, police are putting their lives on the line. But on the other hand, Charles Jordan said at the time that the police are not like any other government agency. There needs to be more accountability if you're going to be in the police force. So the fact that they're organized to always protect themselves against any kind of backlash, it becomes an issue.
The organizing on the waterfront was to get a collective bargaining agreement. So the police couldn't strike and couldn't picket, so they did pickets around the waterfront ports, and the longshoremen won't cross picket lines. So that was the way that they pressured the city to get a collective bargaining agreement. But yes, there's a need for all workers to be organized and to have organizations that look out for your rights and your responsibilities in the workplace. However, what we've seen with the Portland Police Union, as Karen's alluding to, is it's kind of overstepping that purpose and really becoming an organization that's kind of pressuring the city, and an anti-reform organization. It would make police officers' jobs a lot safer if there were some sort of civilian oversight, because some of these tensions between the police and the community might dissipate if there were some sort of effective accountability or oversight. So it isn't necessarily in the interest of police officers to always have a union that's anti-reform, but it might be better served by protecting people's rights and responsibilities within the workplace by being in favor of accountability and transparency.
Any other questions? Yes.
Hi, I know that your research focused on an earlier period, and so it's not pertinent exactly to today, the research that you did, but I'm wondering, you did notice structures and cycles and patterns, and given what you've learned, what would you say to those of us at Portland State today who are considering having sworn police force on our campus?
Yeah, I actually would say it is quite pertinent to today, and this is why history is such an important lens for understanding where we are today. The point of the paper was that we haven't changed much. And this, like Leanna was saying, the idea, I'll get to PSU, but the idea that the city council, led by one of our so-called most liberal members, I'm blanking on her name right now, the only woman on the council, Amanda Fritz, does not want or refusing to have judge oversight. What does that say? It's only with outside intervention that the city has been able to make progress. So to me, the arrogance in the face of people, mothers and fathers and sisters and brothers losing loved ones constantly by mistakes. We cannot pretend. This doesn't always happen intentionally, but people make mistakes. And people die because of those mistakes. Police are human. And the criminal justice research shows that racial perceptions, racial stereotypes, are behind some of these snap judgment thinking, okay? So it is very pertinent to today, and that is why, yes, I voted against having our police armed. We have the regular police here. I'm not sure that we all want public safety. You know, there's a little bit of a trade-off. But yeah, so it's quite relevant today. There was a Dr. Lee Brown, who was a great criminologist on our campus, who was brought in to consult with the police, I think in the early 70s. And he said that the key problem was that the police do not understand the community, and it's the racial stereotypes that they use. So this is why racial residential segregation, the separation of people not growing up with each other, not living around each other, objectifying the other, plays such a role in misunderstandings, right? And in this kind of thing still happening. Okay, there's a price we have paid in this country for the desire to treat Black people as the other, okay? There is a price we continue to pay every day, and young people, I urge you to study the period of the 60s, you know, study all history, but because this goes way back. I find myself going to Reconstruction era relationships, you know, to understand today. But the point I'm making is that what I don't like is also about segregation. I will say we not only don't know each other, people don't know each other, but the knowledge that is passed down. I am so frustrated when I'm trying to teach my urban community development courses, and none of my students have heard or have been taught in high school about American history, urban history, about the riots, rebellions, this kind of thing that was going on in our country. It's not even taught. So there is a segregation of knowledge. Black history is over on this bookshelf. The rest that isn't labeled white history is on that bookshelf, okay? So you have to demand that we learn about ourselves. I'm preaching, ain't I? Anyway, more questions.
Hi, so Karen, you know me. I'm the mayor's wife, and your comment about politicians being held accountable, I have to say, that's the right comment. And I think the past does inform the present. Clearly, your program affirms that there's a combination of reform and then backlash, and reform and backlash. So I'm not my husband, but I campaigned with him for 2.5 years, and he campaigned on police reform. And I would argue that that was part of the reason he was elected. Fast forward, there has been a DOJ settlement that has been approved by the Department of Justice. There have been 4 politicians who said, we want to be responsible for that responsibility. That there has been now a recent employment of a compliance officer. There has been the announcement of a new police chief. All of these, to me, are indications that we're in the process of progression. How do you advise us, if the past informs the future, to assure that all these good things that are in fact happening right now in our city don't go back? And I would argue very strongly that the city council should be responsible for the DOJ settlement. And the city council is in fact doing all the things that the DOJ settlement required to do. So again, help us with that, because we're almost 30 years forward at this point.
There's a hand in the back. I think it might be a response to that.
Great. Okay.
From the Albina Ministerial Coalition for Justice and Police Reform, the things that the city is doing, some of them are good. The majority of them, as they stated, and we agree, are smack in the face of the community, ignoring 4 politicians, ignoring a lot of what the city is saying. Yes, we got a new police chief, but we had no public input or discussion or search. He was named. Yes, we got a settlement agreement. People in the room know that we worked and argued for months to reach that agreement. And on the 9th hour or the 12th hour, before it was time to run out, we then get the city who says to us, we want to do a limited appeal as to what the judge means by evidence. But clearly in these council meetings, and clearly now as we can see from the appeal papers being put forth, they are questioning whether the judge has the right to even call for such an oversight in a hearing. If that's forward progress, you have to convince me that is moving backwards. This is nothing that one in the room knows. We've clearly stated, we're clearly continuing to articulate, it's not moving us forward. That is a slap in the face, and it's moving backwards. I know today that on the city council agenda is a recommendation to hire a COCO, a community compliance officer and a community liaison. Everyone on the selection committee that interviewed said that this group should not be hired. And yet, on Monday night, when you said, you didn't listen to us, Amanda Fritz said, we considered what you said, but we just don't think it's right. So if you're moving forward for progress to help the city, if you ignore what folks say to you, what does that say? That says to us, you really don't care what we say. We're going to do what we want to do. And the pattern, as I watched this and listened to you present today, is the same old soup warmed over, because the same old stuff is still happening today. Come after me if you will, with comments and all of that kind of stuff I'm talking about. But you got to understand, for the sake of the community and a lot of people, this is not good for us and our community.
Add real quickly, with utmost respect for Dr. Bethel, you know that I am all for police reform, have been 10 years I've worked at the police bureau. Two things that I want to address, specifically regarding the DOJ agreement, which AMAC signed on to also. The police bureau and the city have been implementing the measures that are required in that agreement ahead of schedule. It has taken a long time to get to the place where we are today, where the city council can actually choose a compliance officer and community liaison to enter contract negotiations with. That's what the vote is today. During the input that we received from community, pretty much everybody thought that the Rosenbaum team, that is the one that council's going to vote on today, had the skills, the capacity to do the auditing, the evaluation, the reporting portion of the compliance officer part of the job. It's a massive job. I invite anyone to go to the mayor's website and see how massive this job is going to be. Council decided that this group had the capacity to actually do the compliance officer portion. The main concern during the community presentations on September 29th were that, what about, because they're based out of Chicago, so where is the community liaison portion of that job? That role is going to be filled by retired Justice Paul Jimenez, who actually lives in Salem, works part-time at Willamette University, and is highly committed to police reform and the efforts here in Portland. He's going to be at the city council hearing. He was unable to attend the September 29th public presentation. I actually truly believe that if people had heard him, they would have seen, oh wait, okay, they do have that community liaison portion. And then lastly, regarding the appeal, the agreement, it's not a consent decree. A lot of people think that the police bureau and the city fought DOJ in court about saying there was nothing wrong. They actually came to a settlement agreement recognizing there were lots of improvements that the police bureau could make. The police bureau has been actively implementing those reforms. You go to, again, the police bureau website and see all the list of things that are actually going on. There has been a huge change in the way that accountability for use of force is managed within the police bureau. There have been drastic changes in the way that training division is actually evaluating itself and the outcomes from the training that it provides and how those training are designed. I encourage anyone to speak with anybody over there at that table if they want any details on training. We have the captain, sorry to put you on the spot, captain of the training division and one of our long-term partners in reform at the police bureau, Emma Covelli, who is a training analyst and Katie Potter and Lieutenant Graham over there. There are a lot of people in the police bureau who understand the history of things. We know that there needs to be a lot of change to happen, and that change is in progress. If people will ask questions, listen to answers, work collaboratively with, more change can happen even faster. A lot of the pushback from the police bureau, in my experience, has come when there's this camera coming at average officers. Generally, if someone's coming at you with, vinegar and honey. So there are ways to really push forward. I love community input. I love community pressure. It's what's got us where we are. It's what brought DOJ to town in the first place. The DOJ agreement is actually really good. I invite people to read it. There's a lot of reform in it that is actually taking place. So that's my thoughts. Sorry.
You don't have a question? We just have a couple more minutes. Closes at 9. Did you want to say something?
I don't have a question. I just have a comment.
Yeah.
So, if it's okay, I'll make my comment.
Yeah.
So I heard Dr. Bethel make his comment, and I heard you make your comment, and they're almost in conflict. As I'm sitting here listening, I'm listening to a community activist who is telling us from the community perspective, these are the things that we've asked our city to do, our city council to do, and it's not happening. You work for the city? You work for the city, so of course you're going to have a different perspective on the city's point of view. And so as the community, we're caught in the middle of what the city says we're doing and what our community activists says is happening. And as a person from North Portland, who's been there since 1972, I'm still conflicted with what's really going on. That's just my feeling.
I'd just like to say that if the city is truly interested in implementing reform, what harm does it do to have that outside oversight? I attended some of the 2-day hearings that Judge Simon held when the agreement was being implemented, and there were so many people that wanted to come and testify about that they had to open a second courtroom, and that Judge Simon patiently listened to every single community member that had come to tell their stories because they felt that their stories weren't necessarily represented in that particular agreement. So I think having some sort of outside oversight ensures us that the voices that may not be being heard are going to be heard. And if the city is truly interested, and I know it's exciting to see the fact that there are people within the police department, I think now more than ever, kind of pushing for those reforms within the police bureau too. I mean, that is part of that story that didn't necessarily get told in the 10,000 words that we had for Oregon Historical Quarterly, but I think that's a wave of reform that's happening as well. So it's exciting to see that happening, but I think if we're truly interested in reform, there's no harm in having an outside agency hold us accountable.
You know, it's interesting because, yeah, I completely agree. It's, what is the harm in it? And so what we do with politicians, Dr. Leroy Haynes, Dr. Bethel's colleague, we had interviewed in 2012 as we were finishing up this article. I asked him, what did he think? How does it apply to today? And he said, it comes down to the politicians. The politicians have to have the courage and the fortitude. So we know what we do with politicians that don't do what we want. So young activists, you hold your politicians accountable. That's what needs to happen. We have some fine police people here. Gallagher, is it? He contacted me a few weeks ago, this policeman. He had read Bleeding Albina, my paper about the history of disinvestment. Graham, I'm sorry.
Like a cracker.
Huh? Lieutenant Graham. I won't call you a cracker. No, he's cool. Just a little levity. A little levity goes a long way. Leaven's the whole thing, okay? He called because he said, what's interesting to me, again, about the segregation of knowledge and the racial stereotyping, all police, all of us have to understand each other. And he had found that understanding this history made him understand more what's going on as he's trying to do his job in Northeast Portland today. And he wanted the police to come to this understanding of this history, okay, of disinvestment, ghettoization. Why is what's going on today in Black communities, why is it going on? It's planned, it was planned to come out this way, okay? This is genocide. It just people are doing it to each other, and people are getting it from the top. But it's when you have a futureless future. If you as a society see yourself as having a futureless future, and I tell you, I teach community development, and this is my last thing. And then, you know, what's interesting is these community, this push for community control that came up in the 60s, and I'm sure has longer roots. The effort was to have community control, do our own housing, do our own businesses, do our own jobs. We want to get our own economic wealth. Home ownership was a big push. Well, this recent housing crisis, Black and Latino wealth has declined by 2/3. Okay, now the thing is, so what is we need structural change at the very top, which we know we're not getting because we're getting more controlled. Our politicians are bought. The interesting thing is that now I hear, my daughter tells me the new rage, because I've been teaching poverty for 20 years, is the middle class sliding into poverty. Oh, poor middle class, sorry. I mean, all of us are poorer than we were before. But now that it's expanding, whites lost 11% of their wealth because they have so much more wealth, because the Black middle class that follows everything that you need to do, get your college education, go to work, buy your home, be good, has never made more, the Black community has never had more than 5 cents on the dollar for the white community, okay? So what's this about? Now, the white community is seeing the oppression. The ghetto is just simply expanding. So go back to the 70s great music from San Francisco Bay Area, where I'm from, and listen to War. The world is a ghetto. You know that song? That's what's happening. Thank you.
To see happening in Citywise, bringing our scholarly expertise of this history, startling, I'm sure, for some, for others, it's a familiar tune, but bringing it into our contemporary conversation today. It sounds like there are some really important opportunities coming up very soon, possibly even today, for a community to participate and be part of this accountability conversation here in our city, this continued conversation. I think now we all have a grounding in some of the history and the institutions and structures, and there's some folks in the room who maybe can take your comments right now as we're leaving. But I want to thank everyone so much for coming. Again, here we have Dr. Karen Gibson, Dr. Leanna Serbulo from the Toulon School of Urban Studies and Planning, and I hope you all have a wonderful day.